Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep, into a period that's often oversimplified, the years leading up to the Civil War. Most people just see it as North versus South, right? But we're going to dig way deeper than that. We're looking at how race, freedom, and even the very idea of citizenship played out in the antebellum era. Our source material comes from the American History Tellers podcast. They had this incredible interview with Dr. Kate Masur. She wrote the book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement. Trust me, you'll be surprised by what we uncover. It's way more complicated than just a North-South divide.
Yeah, it really is. It's tempting to think of the North as this haven for Black Americans. That just isn't the full story.
Right. Okay, so we all know that all 13 colonies had legalized slavery at the beginning, and that's not exactly news. But Dr. Masur really highlights how Northern abolition wasn't just this, overnight flip of a switch. Different states had their own paths, their own timelines. What really struck me, though, is that even after slavery was abolished in the North, there were still all these laws discriminating against Black Americans. Dr. Masur calls them Black codes in states like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. What were those codes all about?
Well, think about it this way. These codes weren't just about saying no to slavery. They were about controlling Black lives even after freedom. It was like, okay, you're not slaves anymore, but in. And then they hit them with all these restrictions. Registration fees just for existing as a Black person. Bans on testifying against white people in court. Can you believe that? And even barring Black children from public schools.
Wow, that's just cool. It seems like they were deliberately trying to keep Black communities down. I mean, especially that school segregation. It can't just be about economics, right?
You're spot on. It wasn't just economics. Sure, white Northerners were worried about job competition, all that, but these codes went way beyond that. It was about maintaining white supremacy, plain and simple, denying education, limiting legal recourse. It was all designed to keep Black Americans in a subordinate position, even in the so-called Free North.
It's heartbreaking, honestly, but I have to ask, did anyone fight back against this? Were there any bright spots, any success
Oh,
stories?
absolutely. Dr. Masur talks about Ohio. They actually repealed their Black codes in 1849. It's a prime example of what persistent activism can achieve. Even though Black Ohioans were politically marginalized, they didn't give up. They challenged these laws head on. They put out public statements invoking the Declaration of Independence and even Ohio's own constitution. They got really strategic too. They used third-party candidates to influence elections, forcing the issue onto the political stage.
Wow, that's amazing. They really took the fight to them.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating is that it actually worked. Their efforts, along with those of some white allies, they slowly started to shift public opinion.
So change is possible, even when you're facing such deep-seated prejudice.
It's a testament to their resilience and their refusal to accept the status quo.
It gives me hope, even thinking about it today. Now, Dr. Masur also spent some time on Washington, D.C., and it had its own unique set of problems, being right smack between two slave states, Maryland and Virginia. I can't even imagine the tension there.
Oh, D.C. was in a really peculiar situation. It didn't have any local representation in Congress, so you have these legislators from other states, a lot of them pro-slavery, writing the laws for D.C.
Oh, wow. So they had no say in their own governance.
It's crazy, right? And that's actually what made D.C. a major target for abolitionists. They saw it as a place where they could potentially challenge the constitutionality of slavery on a federal level.
That makes sense. It's like the heart of the system.
Right, exactly. And you know what's wild? Even with all the abolitionists there, D.C. still had Black codes, similar to those in the actual slave states.
So even in the nation's capital, Black freedom was just as precarious.
It's a stark reminder of the realities of the time.
And that brings us to Gilbert Horton's story, a story that really drives home that point.
Horton's case, it's like a punch in the gut. It shows you just how fragile freedom could be for Black Americans, even in the North. Imagine this. You're a free Black sailor. You're from New York. You arrive in Georgetown, which is part of D.C. at the time, and bam, you're arrested, suspected of being a runaway slave. That's what happened to Gilbert Horton.
It's unbelievable. How could they just snatch up a free person like that and just claim them as property?
Well, back then, the law was messed up. It put the burden of proof on Black individuals. They had to prove their freedom.
So is guilty until proven innocent.
Basically, yeah. And Horton didn't have his free papers on him. And of course, the authorities didn't believe him.
It's infuriating.
It really is. Luckily for Horton, though, his story got picked up by the newspapers. One paper carrying the ad about his arrest made it all the way to New York. And people who knew Horton recognized him. And they took action.
Wow, so it was really down to chance and the kindness of strangers. Whether a free person was wrongly enslaved,
It's a terrifying thought, right?
Absolutely terrifying. But what happened next? Did anyone in power try to help?
So Horton's father, who was a formerly enslaved man himself, mind you, he contacted the governor of New York,
Oh, wow.
and the governor reached out to President John Quincy Adams himself. And with the public outcry growing, fueled by the news coverage, Horton was finally released.
Thank goodness.
But his story, it's not just about one man's wrongful imprisonment. It sparked a national debate about what citizenship really meant and how precarious black freedom actually was. Here's this citizen of New York legally free, and his freedom is completely disregarded in another part of the country.
It's like the system was designed to fail them.
It exposed these deep cracks in the foundation of the nation, and it fueled the growing debate over states' rights versus the federal government's role in protecting individual liberties.
So it's not just North versus South anymore. It's about whether your freedom as a Black American was even recognized anywhere in the country.
Exactly. And this question of citizenship and its implications for black Americans, it would become even more central as we move closer to the Civil War. Horton's case, it really shows you the fault lines running through the nation. And you know what? Those fault lines just got wider with the Compromise of 1850.
The Compromise of 1850, like a last attempt to hold everything together, right?
Yeah.
It did have some wins for the anti-slavery folks. California is a free state, no more slave trade in D.C., but then the Fugitive Slave Act, that feels like a huge step backwards.
The compromise, it was like trying to patch a crumbling dam. Maybe bought some time, but the pressure was building. And yeah, the Fugitive Slave Act, that was a major concession to the slaveholding South.
Okay, but what made this act so different? Weren't there already laws about returning runaway slaves?
This one, it had teeth. It gave federal marshals the power to enforce it, meaning they could override local authorities, even if those local folks were sympathetic to the fugitives.
So basically, it was federal power trumping local decisions.
Exactly. And here's the even more disturbing part. It denied alleged fugitives the right to testify in their own defense. Think about that.
That's insane.
You're accused of being someone's property.
Yeah.
And you can't even speak for yourself.
It's like the system was designed to be unfair. So what impact did this have on Black communities, especially in the North?
Imagine living every day with the fear that you or someone you love could be snatched away. No due process, no chance to prove your freedom.
It must have been terrifying.
Families were constantly living in terror. Just stepping outside was a risk. The Fugitive Slave Act, it wasn't just about legal technicalities. It created this climate of fear and suspicion everywhere. It permeated black communities across the entire North.
So this act that was supposed to appease the South, it probably ended up having the opposite effect, right? It probably just fueled the abolitionist movement even more.
You're absolutely right. For a lot of Northerners, the ones who were maybe on the fence about slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act was a wake-up call. They saw the brutality of the system firsthand. They saw how basic human rights were being violated. It galvanized a whole new wave of activism, and honestly, it pushed the nation closer to war.
And this all ties back into a fundamental question that Dr. Masur brings up. What did it even mean to be a citizen in the United States at this time? You have enslaved people with no rights, free Black Americans facing constant discrimination, women denied the right to vote. It's confusing.
It really is. And that question, it reveals so much about the contradictions of America. The Constitution, the way it was written, it was vague about citizenship on purpose. It was a compromise, a way to avoid dealing with slavery head on, to keep this fragile union together.
So they basically kicked the can down the road, hoping future generations would figure it out.
Pretty much, yeah. And as we see with the Black Codes, the Fugitive Slave Act, and countless other examples, that ambiguity created a system ripe for exploitation and abuse.
And then in 1857, you have the Dred Scott decision. That just blows up this whole debate about citizenship.
The Dred Scott decision, it's a pivotal moment. It lays bare the deep racial prejudice in the legal system. Here's Dred Scott, an enslaved man who'd lived in free territories. He sues for his freedom. You'd think, based on precedent and just basic fairness, he'd have a strong case.
Right, that seems pretty straightforward.
But the Supreme Court, they don't just deny his claim. They go further. They declare the black people, free or enslaved, cannot be U.S. citizens.
Wow.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
So what was their reasoning? Did they just make that up?
Their reasoning was flawed, completely flawed. They took this narrow interpretation of the Constitution, ignoring the historical reality of black citizenship in early America. They argued that because black people weren't considered citizens when the Constitution was written, they weren't entitled to the same rights as white citizens.
It's just mind-boggling that the highest court in the land could be that blatantly racist. What happened after the decision?
The Dred Scott decision sent shockwaves through the nation. For the abolitionist movement, it was like fuel on the fire. It solidified the Republican Party's stance against the expansion of slavery.
So it actually had the opposite effect of what the court probably intended.
It seems that way. The South, of course, they saw it as a victory. It emboldened those who wanted to protect and expand slavery. The decision was a turning point, no doubt. It pushed the nation closer to the edge of war.
It's a reminder that the law can be used to uphold injustice.
You're absolutely right, and it highlights the importance of constantly being vigilant, of activism. The Dred Scott decision, even though it was a major setback, it ultimately fueled the fight for equality and justice.
It's like sometimes you need those setbacks to propel you forward.
Yeah, it galvanized those who believed in a more inclusive and just society.
And speaking of complicated legacies, Dr. Masur talks about Andrew Jackson, who's often hailed as this champion of democracy.
Jackson's a fascinating case study. He embodies how historical figures can be both progressive and problematic. He was a man of the people. He expanded voting rights for white men. He challenged the elites.
That's the Jackson we learned about in school, right?
Yeah, but then there's the other side. He was also a staunch defender of slavery, and he oversaw the brutal removal of Native Americans from their lands.
The Trail of Tears.
It's like holding two completely different pictures side by side.
How do we reconcile those two sides of him?
It's not about erasing or excusing the bad parts of his presidency. It's about understanding that historical figures are complex. They embody the contradictions of their time. Jackson's legacy shows us that progress for one group often came at the expense of others.
That's a sobering thought.
It's a pattern that we see over and over again throughout American history.
And it's a reminder that we need to keep learning from the past.
Exactly. And that the work of building a more just and equitable society is never truly done. It's a journey, that's for sure. Understanding and action, those have to go hand in hand. And with someone like Jackson, you really see that, how progress and injustice can be so tangled up. And it's a pattern that, sadly, hasn't gone away.
You're right. Sometimes it feels like we're still dealing with the same issues. When you look at decisions like Dred Scott, the highest court in the land, basically saying discrimination is okay, it can feel overwhelming. Like, how do you even begin to fight something so deeply rooted?
It's true. It can feel like an impossible task. But that's why stories like Gilbert Horton's are so important. Remember his father, a formerly enslaved man himself. He refused to accept what happened to his son. He didn't let the sheer scale of the injustice paralyze him. He took action. He reached out to people in power. And he was a crucial part of getting his son freed.
It's a good reminder that even small actions can make a difference. They can ripple outwards, become part of something bigger.
Exactly. And it's not always about grand gestures. It's the everyday choices we make. Speaking out against injustice, supporting the right organizations, educating ourselves and others, getting involved in politics.
It all adds up.
It does.
And I think it's important to remember, history isn't just dates and names in a textbook. It's people's lives, their experiences, their struggles, their triumphs, their hopes. Those are the things that connect us to the past.
Beautifully put.
And those connections can guide us towards a better future.
They can. When we dig deeper into these stories, we understand better how our world came to be, how the past is still shaping our present.
And the choices we make today, those will shape the future for generations to come. It's a big responsibility.
It is. So as you think about this period in American history, ask yourself how its lessons apply to your own life. How can you use your voice, your actions, to push for justice and equality? How can you help build a society that truly lives up to its ideals?
Those are good questions. We've covered a lot today. The complexities of life in the North before the Civil War, the legal battles over citizenship, the long shadow of slavery and discrimination.
We have.
But through it all, we see the resilience of people, the power of collective action, the hope for a more just world.
It's been great talking about this with you, but the journey doesn't stop here.
It doesn't.
Keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep the conversation going.
Thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you think, made you want to learn more. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation alive.